The sound of the glass shattering against the marble floor echoed through the entire restaurant. For a moment, no one moved. The elegant dining hall of La Belle Maison had been filled with soft piano music and quiet conversations just seconds earlier. Crystal chandeliers glowed warmly above perfectly dressed tables, and the scent of roasted garlic and fresh herbs floated through the air. But now, the music had stopped. Dozens of heads turned at once. A young waitress stood frozen beside table 12, her hands trembling slightly as pieces of a shattered wine glass spread across the polished floor. Deep red wine slowly spilled across the white tablecloth like a stain that refused to disappear. And sitting at the center of that table was a man who looked like he owned the entire room. Richard Caldwell, billionaire investor, real estate titan, a man whose name appeared on the covers of business magazines and news articles about billion-dollar deals. And right now, his expression was cold. Very cold. He slowly stood up from his chair. The expensive gray suit he wore looked untouched by the chaos around him. His dark eyes moved from the spilled wine to the waitress standing beside the table. The girl looked no older than 23. Her brown hair was tied back in a simple ponytail. The restaurant uniform she wore was neat but clearly worn from long hours of work. Her name tag read one simple word: Emily. Her cheeks had turned pale. I'm so sorry, she said quickly, her voice barely steady. It was an accident. I'll clean it right away. Have you ever had a moment where you could feel every eye in the room staring at you? Where your heart beats so loudly you think everyone else can hear it? Emily felt exactly like that. She quickly reached for a cloth to wipe the wine spreading across the table. But Richard Caldwell lifted his hand. Stop. His voice was quiet, but it carried across the entire dining hall. Emily froze. Look at what you've done, he said slowly. The people sitting at nearby tables shifted uncomfortably in their seats. I'm truly sorry, sir, Emily repeated. Richard picked up the edge of the stained tablecloth between two fingers as if it disgusted him. This tablecloth alone costs more than your monthly salary. A few guests glanced at each other awkwardly. The restaurant manager, a nervous middle-aged man named Paul, rushed over quickly. Mr. Caldwell, he said with a forced smile, please accept our apologies. We'll replace everything immediately. Richard didn't look at him. His attention stayed on Emily. Tell me something, he said calmly. Emily swallowed. Yes, sir. How much do you make here? The question hung in the air like a trap. Emily hesitated. About $300 a week. Richard nodded slowly. 300. Then he leaned slightly closer. So if I told you that glass you broke costs $200, would you even understand what that means? A quiet murmur spread through the room. Emily's fingers tightened around the cloth in her hand. I can pay for it, she said quietly. Richard raised an eyebrow. Really? Yes. He smiled. But it wasn't a kind smile. It was the kind of smile someone gives when they already know the answer. And how exactly do you plan to do that? Emily looked down at the floor. I'll work extra shifts. Richard laughed softly, but the laugh felt sharp. Extra shifts. He leaned back in his chair. You people always say that. Have you ever seen someone being humiliated in public? Not loudly, not violently, but slowly, word by word, until the entire room feels uncomfortable. That's exactly what was happening. Emily felt the heat rising in her face. But she forced herself to stay calm. Because she needed this job. Her mother's hospital bills depended on it. Every dollar mattered. Sir, she said quietly, I promise I'll take responsibility. Richard tapped his fingers lightly against the table. Then he looked around the restaurant. Every table was watching now. The attention seemed to please him. Well, he said casually, since you insist on responsibility, perhaps we can make this interesting. Emily looked up slowly. What do you mean? Richard reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. From it, he removed a thick stack of $100 bills. Gasps spread through the room. He placed the stack of cash directly on the table. $10,000. Maybe more. Here's a deal, he said calmly. Emily stared at the money. If you can convince me that someone like you deserves even a fraction of this, Richard continued, I'll give it to you. The silence that followed felt heavy. What do you mean? Emily asked softly. Richard leaned forward again. Do something impressive. The restaurant remained perfectly still. Entertain us, he said. A few people shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Paul the manager whispered urgently. Mr. Caldwell, please. Richard raised his hand again. I'm talking to her. His eyes locked onto Emily. So, the challenge hung in the air. Make me believe you're worth it. Emily felt something twist deep inside her chest. Humiliation, anger, and something else. A quiet determination that slowly began to rise. Have you ever been pushed into a corner where staying silent feels worse than standing up? Emily took a slow breath. Her hands stopped trembling. The entire restaurant waited. Some people looked away, embarrassed for her. Others watched with curiosity. Emily slowly placed the cleaning cloth on the table. Then she did something no one expected. She walked away from the table. Not toward the kitchen, not toward the manager. She walked toward the small piano stage at the front of the restaurant. Confused whispers spread through the room. Richard Caldwell leaned back slightly. "What is she doing?" someone whispered. Emily stepped onto the stage. The pianist who had been playing earlier looked at her in surprise. "May I?" she asked softly. The man hesitated. Then he nodded and stepped aside. Emily sat down at the piano bench. For a moment, she simply closed her eyes. The restaurant was completely silent now. Even Richard Caldwell watched with curiosity. Then Emily placed her fingers on the keys and began to play. The first notes were soft, gentle, but they carried across the entire dining hall like a whisper that demanded attention. Within seconds, the melody grew deeper, richer, filled with emotion. People stopped eating, stopped talking, stopped breathing, because what they were hearing was not simple music. It was something far more powerful. Pain, hope, memory. Every note seemed to tell a story. Emily's fingers moved across the piano with surprising confidence. Tears slowly filled the eyes of an elderly woman at a nearby table. A waiter stood frozen near the kitchen doors. Even the manager Paul stared in shock. And Richard Caldwell, the billionaire who had started this entire moment, slowly leaned forward in his chair. Because something about the music felt strangely familiar. Uncomfortably familiar. Have you ever heard a song that suddenly unlocks a memory you thought you had buried forever? That was exactly what was happening to him. The melody continued building, rising, filling the entire restaurant with emotion. And suddenly, Richard realized something that made his chest tighten. He had heard this song before. Many years ago, but that couldn't be possible. Because the only person who used to play it like that was someone he had lost a very long time ago. And now, sitting at the piano in a waitress uniform, this girl was playing it perfectly. To be continued in part 2. For several long seconds after the first melody filled the restaurant, no one spoke. The music floated through the elegant dining hall like something alive. Soft at first, then deeper, fuller, each note carrying an emotion that felt almost too personal for a room full of strangers. Emily's fingers moved across the piano keys with quiet confidence. Her posture was calm, but inside her chest, her heart was racing. She had not played in front of people in years. Not since everything had changed. But tonight something inside her had refused to stay silent. Have you ever been pushed so far that the only thing left to do is show the world who you truly are? That was exactly what Emily was feeling. She wasn't playing to impress anyone. She was playing because the music was the only way she knew how to speak without breaking. Across the room, Richard Caldwell sat completely still. His eyes never left her hands. The melody grew stronger now. The pianist who had stepped aside slowly shook his head in disbelief. "That's impossible," he whispered under his breath. Guests who had been eating moments earlier had now turned their chairs toward the stage. Even the waiters stood quietly along the walls. The restaurant had transformed into something else entirely. Not a place for expensive dinners, but a place for something raw and deeply human. Emily's fingers danced across the keys as the music shifted into a haunting second movement. A melody filled with longing. And suddenly Richard felt something he had not felt in years. A memory, sharp and vivid. A small living room many years ago. A piano by the window. A young girl laughing as her father tried to teach her the same piece of music. His chest tightened painfully, because that girl had been his daughter. Her name was Sophie, and she had been gone for 15 years. The memory struck him so hard that he gripped the edge of the table. But Emily continued playing. She had no idea what was happening inside the man who had humiliated her just minutes earlier. All she knew was that the music inside